So when you were here last year at this summit, we were in a very different place. The entire Senate and the House was absorbed with this debate over whether we should do a big deal or an even bigger deal and what would happen if we didn't. And now the entire issue has sort of fallen off the radar screen, partly thanks to you because you were able to craft a budget deal with Paul Ryan that got us back on regular order, but also because there's this sense that because we're in a midterm election year, nothing big can happen at all. Is that your feeling?
Well, actually, a year ago right now, I had passed a budget in the Senate, and Congressman Ryan had passed his budget in the House, and we were at a stalemate because we weren't even allowed to go to conference, and we were, as we now all know, working our way towards a government shutdown and sequestration kicking in. But the interesting thing is that I had already started talking to Paul Ryan when I talked to all of you last
Secretly.
year. Because I knew that at some point he and I would have to be able to find a path forward. I never predicted it would be as tough as it was to get to the point where we could talk to each other, but we'd already begun to establish that trust, and I think that helped us get to a point where we could sit in a room and discuss that. Your question was, are we done with big deals? And I think the answer to that is that we all know that there's still huge challenges out there from a fiscal responsibility and a deficit responsibility and the investments that this country needs to make sure we're competitive in a global marketplace. Will they happen this year? There are things that can happen this year. Immigration reform, which CBO says would have a $1.4 trillion impact on our deficit in our economy over 20 years. There are big things that can happen in passing our transportation bill that will keep us from going into a transportation crisis and stopping all of our federal funds going to states to make sure people continue to build our roads and highways. We have a workforce investment bill that's very close to an agreement. So I'm hopeful that not only did what Congressman Ryan and I do help us get on a path of better certainty in terms of how Congress operates, but really show people that you can compromise and be applauded and help move our country forward. Big deals are hard, but working towards a big deal by making important steps forward, I think is what we need to do.
People used to say that actually it was easier to do a big deal than a small deal because everyone was going to feel pain. But it seems like what you've proved through your negotiations with Paul Ryan is actually a few small deals might be easier.
Well, I think it's hard to predict the future and what will be right. But I can say this. Don't forget how awful it was last October, and how broken our country felt, and how every business was saying to us that they were losing their business to global competitors because no one trusted that our country could even work or that our government could function. That we were having a sequester kick in and people were on furloughs and not getting paychecks. It was impacting communities. We had a government shutdown that made the entire country feel like we just couldn't even function. It was a very difficult time, and what Congressman Ryan and I had to do was not only put a budget agreement together and compromise on numbers and policies and tough choices, we had to show our fellow congressmen and senators that it was okay to compromise and rebuild that trust.
So you said you were sort of talking quietly behind the scenes before you ended up crafting your negotiation. Are you talking quietly behind the scenes now?
Well, look, I have a tremendous amount of respect for Congressman Ryan. It isn't easy in this environment to come into a room and trust somebody from another party, and he did that. And I did that, and it's why we were able to get a budget agreement. I don't agree with him on every policy, obviously, but I do trust him to share confidences and not use it politically, which is what you have to have and able to reach a compromise in this kind of environment we live in. And I do trust that he knows his caucus and what they need in order to get a win, just as I know my caucus and what they need in order to feel a win. You see, a lot of the discussion around here is how you make sure that you come out of a room talking to somebody and say how awful they were and, throw, I'm better than they are because this is what they believe in political talking points. And I think what Congressman Ryan and I have is a respect of each other in trying to understand what they have to do in their own caucus and what they can put on the table in order to reach an agreement.
There are a lot of members of your party who feel that they and this president have already done a lot of cutting in the past few years, and that the debt and the deficit has been cut more over the past few years than it has in decades prior. So do you think that there's any appetite among Democrats to readdress this issue of cutting the debt some more, perhaps tackling entitlements, which we know is always a tricky issue for Democrats?
Well, let me answer that this way. The short-term deficit outlook, we all know, is better. We are in a better place than where we were, obviously 2, 3, 5, 10 years ago. But where we have a challenge is in the long run. And the drivers of that long-run fiscal challenge is the cost of health care and interest. So interest is about making sure you manage your budget correctly. And what we all know, Democrats and Republicans alike will say, we have focused all of our attention cutting our discretionary funding, and we haven't looked at the other parts of our budget that have a huge impact, including a tax code and including entitlements. And both of those have to be addressed to deal with the long-term fiscal challenges that we have.
So is that something that Democrats can take the lead on and get out in front of? Because I know that they don't like the ideas that Paul Ryan and other Republicans have put forward for ways to reform Medicare, ways to reform Social Security. So where are the Democratic ideas that really get at?
Actually, I've put a number of ideas on the table in conferences if you're talking about entitlement reform, but I think it's really important for all of us to remember what Chairman Yellen of the Federal Reserve said before our budget committee just a week ago, which is our economy is very fragile, and how we cut the deficit in the short term will have a huge impact on our economy in the long run and our ability to deal with our fiscal challenges. So we have to be very smart about how we do this. Reforming our entitlements in a really aggressive mode right now and shifting the cost, as some have suggested, to seniors can dramatically impact our economy. Cutting back our education system at a time when we have a deficit in education and we have a deficit in infrastructure and we have a deficit in innovation when the rest of the world is focusing on investing in their deficits in those fields will have a real drag on our economy and our ability to deal with our long-term fiscal challenges. We have to address all of this, and yes, Democrats do have ideas. I am impressed by a number of members of our caucus who are really focused on the cost and the drivers of cost of health care overall and how we can do delivery reform. And in fact, some of the examples that we are now seeing from the innovation that was passed in healthcare reform. Everybody thinks healthcare reform is just about exchanges. There was a lot more to that. One of it really focusing on innovation, on controlling costs, on cost containment. We are beginning to see a number of projects coming back at us that will save us dramatic amounts in our healthcare costs in the future and drive that healthcare costs down. So we do know that we have to look at our entitlements. There's no doubt about it. We have an aging population. We have fewer people in the workforce. But we can't do it in a way that upsets our economy. And secondly, we have to do it in a balanced way. When we look at our long-term fiscal challenges, we cannot just say, well, the only way we're going to get out of this is to change entitlements and not look at how everybody in this country, from the smallest person to the wealthiest person, contributes a fair share of that. That's the driving force that Democrats have gone into every negotiation with. It is what every bipartisan commission on fiscal responsibility has talked about doing, and it's what we need to continue to push.
So then let's talk about tax reform, because you can't find a single person on Capitol Hill, Democrat or Republican, who won't say, yes, our tax system is broken, we need to do tax reform, it's a huge priority. Every year, Speaker Boehner says it's his biggest priority, and then nothing happens. Why?
Well, Ron Wyden, I love what he says. He says our tax code is 100 years old and it looks like it. And I think as the new chairman of the Finance Committee and as a senior member of the Budget Committee, he's second to me on budget, understands the need to focus on how we make this tax code work. for our country, for our deficit, and for our economy, and for our future. He obviously came into his new position just a few months ago. He is tackling with the tax extenders on the floor as we speak. He is looking at a number of
Should we
issues.
have to pay for those tax
short-term, but-
extenders, by the way? Should we have to pay for them?
Well, that's a debate that we're all having. Ron would say this is the last time we're going to do short-term extenders. Needs to get done. It's a critical impact on our economy. But he is looking at it as this is the last time we're going to do this. We need to do overall tax reform. So in answer to your first question, I think that Ron Wyden has come into this with a real willingness to tackle a huge challenge. We don't know who the next chairman of the House Ways and Means Committee is going to be. It's a chance at someone who's very good to work with and understands compromise. We'll see. But I think that the motivation for it is real. We all know we're losing our competitive edge because of the tax code. We know that the tax code has enormous loopholes that Republicans and Democrats both agree on. But we also have to come to an agreement that tax reform has to help us with our fiscal challenge and not just be tax reform to be tax reform.
Senator Baucus also worked very hard on this issue for a number of years as the Senate Finance Chair, and he was working very closely with Dave Camp in the House, and he didn't seem to get a lot of backup from his party on this issue. Do you think that Senator Wyden will have more success?
Well, I think the lesson from Paul Ryan and I working to come up with a budget agreement when no one thought we could, and we did better than that, we did a 2-year agreement, is that you have to do tax reform in a way that is sellable to your caucus and that is sellable to the country and helps restore that trust that we can't get anything done. It's going to take a lot of work. It's going to take a lot of compromise, and it's going to take a lot of understanding. But I think that Ron Wyden has the capability to do that, and I hope that he can.
One of the
I think if he tries to tackle absolutely everything, throw out the tax code, start over,
right,
he won't get the support because it's too hard in Congress.
One of the things you've been talking a lot about lately is that we talk a lot about the deficit, but we don't talk as much about the education deficit and the infrastructure deficit, and those are all things that you feel, in a way, are going to hurt our long-term fiscal outlook as well if we don't address them. What do you mean by that?
Well, look, if you look around the globe, we'll just take education as an example. China today is investing heavily in early childhood education. This is actually a no-brainer. 50 years of study shows that investing in early childhood education means we have a workforce who has the skills that they need, that can grow the economy. We have fewer people in jail. We are much more secure. We are doing the exact opposite as China and some of our other future competitors by undermining all of our education system today by using it to help solve our fiscal problem. That has created an education deficit where we are going to be unable to compete in the future, and the economy in the future will be much more fragile. The same with infrastructure. If we continue to just let our bridges and roads and highways crumble, as has happened in my state with a major bridge on I-5, our main corridor, a year ago, then we can't get our goods to market. And other countries will begin to purchase their goods from countries that have a much more secure infrastructure. So we have those deficits, and we can't just continue to cut education and research and development and our infrastructure and say that's balancing our budget and we'll be fine in the future.
But Republicans would say, that sounds like a lot more government spending to me, or stimulus spending. So how do you break through that argument?
By making the economic argument that if we undermine our capability to be a strong country in the future with an educated workforce and an infrastructure to manage our economy in a very good way, and if we haven't focused on research and we've lost all of our competitive edge to other countries who are investing in research and the next products and the next goods to be able to be sold, that means we're going to have a huge deficit in the future because there won't be a tax base to support that, and we're going to be in a world of hurt. So I think it has a very strong fiscal component to it.
I have a question from the audience that sort of bounces off that. They asked sorry, that's the wrong question. How do you ensure that infrastructure investments get made on the merits rather than based on politics and power?
Well, I think that there are a lot of good ways to put in place policies that help make sure that our infrastructure is done in a way that works for our country and helps us compete. You will always have projects. I mean, I love the fact that we have decided that earmarks are no longer tolerable, which means that members of Congress don't make the decision. And the first question is, well, who does? And I always believe it's my job as the senator from my state to help make sure that the projects that we build help more than one community and really help grow our economy. And I work really hard to do that. But somebody in the Department of Transportation doesn't know the regional interests or needs for our economy as well as your member of Congress. So there has to be a balance on this, I'm just saying. But I do think the Tiger program, which I wrote and implemented on funding for infrastructure, is a great way to go. It is a competitive project that you have to make the case that the infrastructure project, whether it's a port system or a transit system or a highway system, is something that will help grow the economy. And that, I think that kind of policy will help us get to making sure we make the right investments.
And there is this argument that you hear more and more these days that earmarks, while sometimes wasteful, were sort of a down payment on getting people to take uncomfortable votes that could save a lot more money in the long run if you, say, crafted a debt reduction deal correctly. It might not be in someone's interest to take that vote. It's a painful vote, but if they're getting a little something, it's sort of...
Well, I think that conversely, in Congress, it's easy to vote no. And you have to have an investment in the legislation that's in front of you. You need to be able to go home and sell why this is important. And if you don't have that, it's much easier to have a government shutdown because you don't have anything vested in it other than a crisis in our country. And that's what we saw happen last fall.
Before we let you go, what do you think that Congress is most likely to achieve on this front this year? What's at the top of your agenda when it comes to dealing with the debt and the deficit?
Well, I think one of the most important things we can do in the short term before the election actually is to pass immigration reform. As I said, CBO says that will help our deficit and grow our economy by $1.4 trillion over the next 20 years. And to me, it's kind of stunning deficit hawks who don't look at that and say this will help us get to a better place fiscally. This is actually something Congressman Ryan and I talked a lot about in the many, many, many conversations that we had. This was part of it, and he is actually in the same place I am.
If it doesn't happen before the midterms, do you think it's something that could happen in the lame duck?
We now have a lot that's going to happen in the lame duck.
Always, yes.
I think that that the right thing to do would be to have the vote now in the House. We believe we have the votes for it. Get the policies implemented, and let's move on to the next challenge. We have a lot of them.
Your budget deal goes through the end of 2015, and we're going to be right back in an election year in 2016. Are we going to be in the same boat where people say we can't make big, hard choices because it's an election year, we don't want to give the other side a win, we don't want to take any chances, and it gets punted again?
If that's the attitude that people come into this with, it will be very difficult. If they come into this with the attitude that Congressman Ryan and I sat down, talked about many times, and really focused on is that we need to replace sequester. Both sides agree that that is damaging to our economy. If we both listen to each other and learn to trust each other, if we find common ground rather than throwing political points at each other, and if we agree that governing by crisis is not what the American people deserve, we won't be in that position.
Well, Senator Patty Murray of Washington State, thank you so much
for
continuing to talk and for talking with us today. We really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you very much.